All right, welcome to our lecture on what role religion plays in political conflicts. The slides are designed to accompany the book People, Places, and Culture. I am, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, before we get into specific political conflicts, what we need to do is talk a little bit about what types of religious attitudes lend themselves to engaging in open conflict with other groups, and then we'll also go through and we'll look at some specific examples of various conflicts in the world. So the first one I want to talk about is religious fundamentalism. And fundamentalism just means that the beliefs are non-negotiable, they're uncompromising. Okay. A great example of this, if we were talking about Christianity, might be biblical literalists. Okay, people who believe that the Bible is literally the Word of God, that it is written as God intended, that we cannot change it, that we cannot interpret it. Okay, that type of uncompromising belief is what we're talking about. If we were going to talk about Islam, these are the folks who believe that there can be no compromise or no accommodation with other societies, that you have to try and follow the Quran as it was written and interpret it as it was interpreted in the time when it was written. Okay, so this is what we mean when we talk about fundamentalism, that they're non-negotiable, they're uncompromising, it is what it is, it will not change, it cannot change. Okay, religious extremism is a version of fundamentalism, and essentially what it is it's fundamentalism carried to the point of violence. Okay, fundamentalists can be extremists, but not all fundamentalists of any given faith are extremists. Okay, so it's important to note here that you can be fundamentalist and not be an extremist. And the big difference there is that issue of violence. Okay, so you can believe in not compromising on your religious faith at all, or in not making exceptions or not accommodating other belief systems, but do it in such a way that you're not physically harming other people. And that's an important distinction that we want to make when we're talking about any given religious group. So, just to give some examples of some specific religions and talk about kind of the fundamentalism and extremism within them. Right, so if we talk about, say, within Christianity, that traditionalist Catholic movement, these are the folks who believe that, for example, all Catholic masses ought to be conducted in Latin, which they were until about 1968, I think it was, that church doctrine ought to be unchanging. So these are the folks who were very firmly against birth control, for example, or any kind of ordination of women, or if we're talking about the Catholic Church, administering any of the sacraments to people who are divorced, those kind of very traditional beliefs. When we're talking about Protestants, that fundamentalism, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, oftentimes comes out in that biblical literalism. Okay, is probably the easiest example to talk about fundamentalism. In both cases, what we could do if we want to take it to the extremist point of view, what we could use as examples are, for example, those folks who say bomb abortion clinics. Okay, so you can protest an abortion clinic and be a fundamentalist without being violent and being an extremist. And it's those folks who bomb the abortion clinics then who are the extremists. If we want to talk about Judaism, right? Talk about Orthodox conservatives, these are the folks who are very conservative in their outlook, so they have very specific gender roles. For example, they're the ones who might say that women cannot read the Torah, at least not in temple, right? And be very specific that in the temple there are spaces for men and there are spaces for women, and those spaces are separate. Okay? That's fundamentalism, that's conservatism. On the other end, we get extremist groups, and I'm not familiar with these two specific ones. I'm going to go with Kahane Chai, perhaps. But certainly these would be, anytime we get anybody who's committing an act of violence, would be an extremist. So if we wanted to go back in history, we could certainly find extremists in Judaism within, say, the Zionist movement, where there were massacres committed and things like that against Palestinians in an effort to drive them out of their homes in an effort to make a Jewish homeland. Again, not everybody did this. This is an important distinction we need to draw when we're talking about these. In Islam, oftentimes that fundamentalist point of view, again, that, the Quran is unchanging, that we should interpret it much as it was interpreted at the time Muhammad lived in the mid-600s. Okay, that's fundamentalism. Extremism would be, for example, those folks who talk about jihad. The example in your book, they talk about the Taliban in Afghanistan. The more modern example would be, for example, ISIS over in Syria and Iraq. Okay, these are people who take their fundamentalism to the point of violence. In the case of ISIS, doing things like beheading people who refuse to convert, and the Taliban in Iran was famous for doing, in Afghanistan, not Iran. Taliban in Afghanistan was famous for doing similar sorts of things, for chopping the hands off of thieves, right, or stoning women who have committed adultery. That is extremism. Being fundamentalist, not extremist. If we want to talk about some specific conflicts, we could look at the ongoing series of conflicts between Israel and the Palestinians, right? So we could start talking about, really, there's not much conflict between Israel and Palestinians during World War II, but that's where the roots of the later conflicts come from, because that's what causes many Jewish folks to move into what was then Palestine, is now modern-day Israel. And then once Britain backs out and says, we're not going to have anything to do with it, the Jewish folks get together, declare a state. Shortly thereafter, we have, really for the next 30 plus years, an ongoing series of conflicts. Every several years there's a series of conflicts. For example, in 1967, Arab-Israeli War, the Yom Kippur War, and each time what we've got are people fighting in part based on belief systems and access to holy sites, but also over land and other resources, right? Fights to keep the West Bank of the Jordan River, which is now predominantly a Palestinian area. Hamas is one of the Palestinian groups, one of the more extreme groups. They certainly fit that description of extremist in that they tend to fire missiles periodically into Israel. In Nigeria, and Nigeria is actually in some ways a very good example for much of Africa, right around that area where we've got a Muslim north and a Christian south, because it's right along kind of that border between the Sahara and southern Africa. And what you see in many of these countries is there's ongoing conflicts between the Muslim north and the Christian south, having a lot to do with the resource distribution and things like that. And religion becomes then just one more piece of that conflict and one more thing to argue about. In the case of Nigeria, what's going on currently is you've got a group of Islamic extremists up in the north who are kidnapping and killing people and things like that, and slowly but surely the government trying to drive them out from the south. I want to talk about the former Yugoslavia, which was a country when I was your age. What we can talk about is the Balkan Peninsula and how that separates the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, and how there's some conflicts there over who's going to believe what and which countries are going to be predominated by which religion and how ethnicity plays into all of that. And I'm not quite as familiar with those conflicts, to be perfectly honest. Talk about Northern Ireland, right? So the island of Ireland itself is split into two parts on a basic level. We've got the country of Ireland, which forms most of it, and then we've got Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. And Northern Ireland is split between Catholics and Protestants. And while peace has been the norm lately, the last few years, for a long, long time, there was a whole lot of violence going on in that area, based out of religion and colonial histories and things like that. So let's take a look at a few maps. We're going to start out, we'll go ahead and look at, this is a map of modern-day Israel. See, well, I should say it shows most of Israel. It doesn't quite show all of it. But when we look at this, we can see the West Bank of Israel. And if you look kind of towards the middle there, you can see the city of Jerusalem. Okay, and what's been happening is slowly but surely Palestinian territory is getting eroded as there have been more and more settlements built, as there's been a security fence built around parts of it that went within areas that were formerly claimed by the Palestinians and the like. And it's this ongoing conflict in part over land, arguably at least as much as about religion and access to the land and who has rights to the land and things like that. And you could do a whole class, whole college level class itself just on the history of modern Israel and talk about the conflicts and look at the basics of all of it and what happened. We don't have time to do that here. Looking at Northern Ireland, you can see if we look at our map here, what we've got are, you can see how most of the map is that kind of yellow color, which would indicate that it's a Protestant majority, but then we've also got pretty significant areas that are Catholic majorities. And what's happened over the years is that those Protestant majorities are actually the descendants now of folks who came over from England, of folks who came over from Scotland, right, and essentially colonized Ireland. And then those Catholic areas oftentimes are representative more of indigenous Irish folks. And it's this long history of fighting back and forth for who's going to have control of this area of the country and who's going to have the right to dictate the terms. And it traces its way back again to that colonial history when the British did a lot of very negative things. And from that history then what you get is that ongoing sense of grievance on the part of the Catholic folks who are then taking it out on the Protestant folks who, unsurprisingly, when they're attacked, feel the need to attack back. And it's that ongoing back and forth, in some ways very similar to what's going on with the Israelis and the Palestinians, right, in that tit for tat back and forth. But unlike what's going on with Israel and Palestine, what's happened here is there's managed to be a negotiated peace, and so the violence is nowhere near what it used to be. Right? Indeed, it basically is non-existent in terms of the levels it used to be. So, in our lecture here, we've talked a little bit about what types of religious attitudes lend themselves to conflict. So, talked about fundamentalism, we've talked about extremism, and then we've talked a little bit about some specific fundamentalist and extremist groups and activities and things like that. And then we went through and we looked at a couple of we looked at some examples and then looked a little more in depth at some other examples. If you've got questions, I'd be delighted to answer any questions you have, and please feel free to bring those in the class, and I'll see you the next time we meet.